Hey guys, before we get started, I just want to let you know that Outward is a survival RPG that supports full co-op, whether it's split screen or online. And this review is mainly going to be on the co-op experience, as I played it with a friend of mine, Nathaniel Moore. And I'd actually recommend if you've never played Outward to listen to this more as like a podcast without watching the video, because some of the things we're going to be showing in the video, some of these places you're going to be visiting, are just some of the best parts of the game and really deserve to be experienced inside the game. So like the video if you enjoy it and subscribe to the channel, and let's get into it. Welcome to the Brevosity. I'm Brevon, and with me today is Nathaniel Moore, someone that's going to be on the channel more often here in the next few months and weeks. Today, we're here talking about a game, an RPG, that me and Nathaniel have played for a few years since it came out, which was just a few years ago, from a small studio, NineDots, published by DeepSilver, Outward. It's a survival action RPG that's really not like anything I've ever played before. It's really focused on the journey and the adventure of it all. It takes place in sort of a medieval world, but it's even in its setting, especially in its setting, it's so unique that you can't even place it in a time period. But we'll get into that here in a minute. Like I said, the game is a survival action RPG, and it's really hard to explain even what the game is without going into really deep detail, which we want to do in these later sections. What I'll say is, well, it has survival elements. You're not going to be building things. It's not really a survival game. There's diseases. There's a hunger meter, and things like that. You have to sleep. But it's really about going and journeying through these lands and going through these dungeons and gaining new skills and weapons to take on more advanced dungeons and go to farther lands. There is a story, and you will be completing those quests, but it's more focused on the exploration through these worlds. It's not open world, but it is sort of. It's not fully open world, but there's 4 large regions that you'll explore and go through. What do you got to say about Outward, Nate? What makes Outward so unique and such an interesting game?
I'd say that the very first thing that really caught my eye that made me think this is different from almost anything I've played before is definitely the art design. The art design is amazing.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, as soon as you leave the starting town, it's just, I mean, the starting town's a cozy, sort of like similar to some MMOs, early towns, just your sort of like the Shire, just your cliche fantasy little town. It's a fishing village, but it's just a nice little village. But as soon as you leave that town, it'll hit you right from the first region that you explore. There is a giant purple mountain and just a beautiful landscape ahead of you. Now, the actual graphics of this game, I mean, it looks like something out of early 7th gen, like early 360 PS3 type stuff is what it really looks like, with a little bit more detail because it is a newer game, just came out a couple years ago. But it's from a small studio, NineDots, which was, I think, under 10 people, probably 9 people when the game first released. But after, they have more people on there now. So especially just in that first region, Nate, other than that giant purple mountain, what do you think, what's the first thing that really caught your eye about the art design?
Well, in the first region with the giant fields around the giant purple mountain, I really noticed the pearl birds that look kind of like chocobos from Final Fantasy.
Oh yeah.
And when I saw one of those, I was just like, what? It's like an ostrich, but way featherier. And then hyenas. I remember, I think I died initially to some hyenas the very moment that I left because I wasn't prepared for the combat.
And it's, maybe they were, like, there's also troglodytes in the first area, and maybe these things were cliched at one point, but we just really haven't seen those things in modern fantasy games, like the Elder Scrolls and other modern fantasy games. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I know there's plenty. Dragon Age. There, I got the other one out.
Yeah. I remember that one of our, I think actually the first encounter with the troglodytes was when we went into the storage area underneath the village. And that was one of the unique ways you can leave the village initially. Like, I wasn't prepared when some giant bug men just appeared and started whooping me. And speaking of the trogs, their design, they actually have different classes of trogs practically. And each class glows a different color in the dark, so you'll see a green glowing bug guy start running at you in the middle of a cave, and that would be like the average warrior. Then a red one, which is like the brute version. They're more powerful hits, have more health. And then you got purple ones that'll just start shooting you with magic from a distance. But not only do the trogs have different classes that affect the way they look, but trogs actually have their own weapons as well. Some of them will carry a mushroom shield. Some of them have special staffs that only trogs have. And when you kill them, you can actually pick that up.
And there's some of that uniqueness in the design of those trogs too, with their unique weapons and the mushroom shield, like you said, that they've got from these dank caverns that they live in. And then with the enemy design, you've got your basic bandits, and what we've said has been a little bit basic. Bandits and hyenas are a little bit a different take on sort of wolf that's usually in the first areas. But even in that first area, we also have the bullet shrimp.
Yeah, the bullet shrimp. I remember when we saw that for the first time, we were just like, what is that? Then all of a sudden, a giant ball of lightning came flying at us from it. And it turned out to just be a giant version of the rainbow shrimp that exist in real life. They kind of punch things, except when this thing punches, it shoots a ball of lightning at you.
And it's something unique. I mean, we have swamps with dinosaurs, but then on the other side we have mechanical golems that look like something out of a steampunk or industrial era type golem looking thing.
And then the purple glowing ghost skeletons that walk around in a redwood forest.
Yeah, and something else, something that could be more generic in another game, where instead we have ghosts that are purple and red depending on their
rank,
what type they are, and that works with the co-op in the game. And you can call out, I see a red one, that one's stronger. I see the trog, that one's fire, get out ice. There's just an overall uniqueness to things you don't see in most other fantasy games, like Wendigos, and which their Wendigo design is different than you might have seen in other games, with elongated limbs and more animalistic look.
And frost damage.
Yeah, with ice. There's these large scourge beasts, which are a corruption, sort of like the Darkspawn and something like Dragon Age, or they're just these amalgamations of flesh that almost Lovecraftian in a sense that attack you. And it's a mix of all these different things, but it never feels, it still feels cohesive. It still feels like a world and not just a bunch of random crap thrown at the wall.
Yeah. They do a pretty good job at making sure that these enemies are in like specific locations as well. So you're not just gonna randomly run into some random type of enemy that shouldn't be there.
Right.
They're usually gonna be in a good spot, so it doesn't feel like they're just throwing new enemies at you for no reason. Like, you actually have to go to these certain places for these enemies to be a problem for you.
And that's something that works with the art design throughout the entire thing. This is all handcrafted. Everything is placed with extreme intent, and especially in the art design, but over the whole production, over the whole game, you see just the heart and the care that's went into every single part of this game, and just that somebody had a vision, and these people really helped them, or a group of people had a vision, and they just all really did a good job of seeing it through.
And also, more on how they kind of come up with some really good enemy designs. Like, it's kind of like they just take a good starting point, like, let's say deer, and then they're just like, how about we light it on fire and make sure it doesn't have a head and that its antlers are telekinetically flying at you practically.
And then put it in a world where reality is bending and everything is or where everything is on fire as well. It's just, like I said, there's intent in this. It's not just random artwork, but it still feels so unique everywhere you go.
Yeah, and each region has a lot of its own unique enemies as well. Not just like different parts of the region, but the regions as a whole each feel very, very different from each other.
Yes, they feel very distinct. There's the swamp region, the desert region, the hills/mountain region, and then, of course, the forest, the redwood forest in Merkur. With the, what did you say, deer? No, purple ghost skeletons.
Ghost skeletons. There is fire deer there, though.
Yeah, and there's regular deer.
Gigantic red muscular deer.
But moving past naming off these enemies, their designs are excellent, and that unique art design shows in the overall regions and the cities within these regions. There's a city in each one of these regions that has friendly faces and just NPCs that may give you quests to my home. Like I said, the first village that you come from, Cierzo, is a small fishing village led by Risa, and it's sort of tribal type thing, which is interesting because you have guns, flintlock pistols, you have this almost electrical looking technology that's involved with magic somehow, but then you also have these tribals in a fishing village using spears. But it makes sense within the setting itself.
In the tribal village, most of the buildings you're going to see are kind of like log cabins in the way that they're designed. And then there's a few small structures that kind of just look tribal, or like kind of like how pioneers would have their different little things around their towns.
Right.
And as soon as you get away from that, though, all the other towns get way more unique.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Way out there.
Absolutely. There's 4 other towns, I believe, in the base game. There is the city of Monsoon, which is a technological and ecological, I suppose, wonder. It's just it's gorgeous. And we have the Ash Giant Village, which is a large villa-type building with a small town inside of it.
Yeah, very kind of like Taj Mahal looking in the way its roof is built.
Yeah.
Except gigantic, large enough to house smaller buildings within that one huge building.
Yeah, and that's it's almost got the Middle Eastern vibes, although the more Middle Eastern stuff is when you head to towards Levant, which is a kingdom, but it does have it's out in a desert, and it does have some Middle Eastern style of buildings. And
yeah. And then Berg. Berg is very unique in its style. I would kind of describe it as a mixture of like Eastern Asian architecture mixed with Aztec or Mayan architecture.
Yeah, and they are it's the capital of the tribal faction, so that makes sense. But they're being aided by a larger technological force, which we'll get into later in the story. But this game isn't really that much about the story. It's more about these beautiful environments and what you'll be doing within them, not necessarily why. So that's why I wanted to get into that later. But yes, talking about Berg, it's just the first time you go into any of these towns, your jaw drops and the music is pulsing in your ears. It's not hype music or anything. It's really good music, but it's not gonna. I don't know. It's really good music.
One thing, though, is they have a lot of unique stuff about how different societies would react within these different worlds. Like, talking about Monsoon, it shows that in a world where gigantic lily pad flowers exist, that people turned one into a giant building. on an island far off from the swamp and all the danger. They use leaf petals as canoes to get over there and built a giant city around the building they built in the lily pad flower. It's really unique. I remember the first time seeing it, it was like breathtaking. Almost,
Yeah, absolutely.
like, I didn't even notice it at first. And then when I looked up and realized that that is a giant lily pad flower they're living in, I was just like, wow, this is very, very unique to any kind of fantasy I've played.
And again, it's not graphically impressive. It's not, you're not looking at the flower like, wow, look at the detail on everything. It's just the technical limitations don't
like,
hold it back.
The creativity that they used there, they came up with some pretty original ideas on how things should look and the environment.
Within these cities and these environments, you have all these characters, these NPCs you're going to be dealing with, and they have very distinct outfits. Especially, there's 3 factions in the game, and they all have very distinct outfits. The armors your character wears are all very interesting looking with different. It's the same variety that the environments have with different influences.
They almost have different art designs on different armors completely for some of them, I'd say. Like, some of the armors are your classic medieval, like, plate armor and things like that, but some of their tribal armor is made out of, like, bone and has antlers on the head. And then you get into some of the Elot faction armor is like priest outfits. They're wearing like white robes with red accents on them. And then when you get to the wizard outfits, you got people wearing gigantic, like ridiculously large
Gandalf hats.
Yeah, Gandalf hats. And then witch clothes with crow feathers coming off the shoulders and things like that.
There's Eastern influences, there's Middle Eastern influences, there's Western fantasy influences, there's futuristic influences. There's all these things, and it feels like you said, there's different art styles, but it's like the game itself. Each of these armors within, like, the game itself has the same art style all throughout, but whoever made this armor in the game has a different art style than the person who made the armor in the within the setting. With you can see a uniqueness in, because this group of people made this type of armor or this weapon. There's that uniqueness in it.
Yeah, like one of the in-game armors, the one that I got at least in the very end of the game, had almost like a Oni face, like a Japanese demon face in the helmet, and had some kind of almost samurai influence to it, but at the same time kept itself pretty distinct from how samurai armor usually looks.
And added some of that tribal influence of the faction that we ended up choosing to play through the game with. There was tribal influences within the Oni outfit as well. But from the beginning of the game, you're not wearing these badass Oni armors and plate armors from the very beginning. You're going to look like a fisherman or the farmers or
peasant.
Yeah, exactly. What you start off the game $500 in debt. You're not. You have to get there, and that's the game does offer a good progression loop, even in the cosmetic areas. Like, you start out with a large rusty sword or fishing spear or small little broken piece of metal for your dagger, and by the end of the game you're using ornate ancient daggers crafted by magical beings that give fire, or a large magical halberd type thing that would be a great sword for a wizard that Nate ended up using through his wizard character.
Yeah, the weapon design is also very interesting. Like, there's bone weapons, there's starting off just normal iron weapons. That's the very baseline stuff. But then later on, you get magic glowing red daggers or magic blue glowing maces. You get weapons made of golden lich material. There's all sorts of different weapons throughout the game, and there's a lot of weapons that are unique within the game. There's only one of them throughout the whole game. Like, he talked about my magic halberd that kind of looks like a sword at the end of a long stick that glows with some magical rainbow colors.
Practical? Kind of. No.
Yeah.
Good for a wizard? Maybe.
Yeah, a wizard that won't stop himself from getting his hands dirty and just start cleaving you with a halberd.
So, another thing is there's a magic system in the game, and as well as some tools and traps, and that allows, and the designs within that are really good. There's good explosions, small ones from pressure plates, or a flamethrower from a lantern, and just all those effects look really good. They sound really good. There's a punchiness to the fire. There's
and with the lighting of the magic, there's a lot of different colors incorporated with different spells. Like, there's a whole set of spells as just different, like, flaming runes you cast up, and you use them in combination to make a spell be cast. All those work as their own light sources, and that's something that I think this game has a really strong point in, is their lighting is done very well in most of the game.
And one of the reasons for that is the lanterns, because the game gets very dark and you're going to have to carry some sort of light source with you. Usually it would be a lantern, but there's multiple ways, like the spells, and there's runic lanterns you can get, which is a certain tree of magic. There's fireflies in the swamp that'll follow you where you go and light things up. There's different ranks of lanterns and
soul lanterns that you can use for unique attacks. And I think also going along the lines of different design choices with magic is a lot of spells have their own audio, though when casting the runes, usually the same audio when you cast a rune, but when they put together to make a spell, usually has pretty unique audio.
There's decent audio all throughout. It's nothing spectacular, but a sword sounds like a sword. There's monster sound effects are pretty good. Voice acting is actually, there's not much of it. There's a little bit, sort of like old GameCube games, kind of, some of them. I don't really have an example, don't know why I said that, but they just say a little blurb of what they would say fully, and you're going to read the rest. So, old CRPGs, that's a better one, like Wasteland 2, things like that. I went off on a pretty bad tangent that went on for a while, but going back to sound, Nate, hit us with the sound.
Continuing with sound, or at least sound-related aspects, is the music. The music is a fantastic part of this game.
Absolutely.
Very unique. I know we've used that word a lot, but that is one of the ways that I would describe it. One of the best ways is because they use various less commonly used instruments in their music. Like, you don't really hear a lot of games where somebody's just killing it on the flute.
And that's something you're going to hear us say a lot throughout the review, is unique, distinct, original, and that's just, it's seen in everything they do. It's all, it's a very cohesive vision and picture, and that comes in the music. It's adventurous, and that's what I would see in the whole game. It's very adventurous. It's about an adventure, a journey.
The music kind of almost like inspires me to go out and start doing stuff in the game.
Right.
Like, it also kind of gives a pretty good aspect of being music that can actually be made with the technology level that people have in that world. It's kind of like music you'd expect to hear in a world like that.
But it's not always upbeat and adventurous. I mean, you have dark caverns that are crypts where it hits lower points, and I don't think there's too many tracks. There's a few different combat tracks, I believe. Each region, I believe, has its own specific track. Some cities have their own specific track. Monsoon and Berg do, I know. Might be the same in every city, might be the same track, but I'm not sure about that. But the music was just very good across the board. I mean, we're not musicians, or we're game people. We're not too deep into music, so we can't really get into the specifics of why it's so good. But I mean, just listen to it for yourself. It's just awesome. If you don't think so, I mean, tell us in the comments below. But so moving on from the music and its quality, though, we're going to talk about we're going to get into the actual gameplay here. Let's talk about now that we've talked about the setting and the place you're going to be exploring and adventuring through this journey simulator. It's like Oregon Trail mixed with a fantasy RPG. Like, not really, but it gives similar vibes. Let's talk about the first thing, the main thing you're going to be doing in Outward, and that's the exploration. So let's talk about how these areas are designed. So like I said, you've got 4 large regions, each with a distinct biome and layout. And within each of these 4 regions, there's distinct locations, whether they be dungeons or villages. There's caves, just different locations you're going to be visiting. Each one has about 10 or so locations to visit, with small unmarked locations scattered in between each of these. So like I said, each location, each region is pretty distinct, and we're going to start out talking about Chersonese, the very first region. Why don't you take us into that, Nate?
Chersonese, like we had said in the art design, one of the things you notice immediately is a giant purple mountain. Well, that purple mountain can actually be kind of an obstacle to get around. It kind of makes sure that you need to go a little bit out of your way to get to the other regions in the game. And the purple mountain itself is a couple ways you can try to get to the top, but going past that, Chersonese is one of the few regions that you'll have actual, real season change that you'll notice. One of the things that has really kind of been a challenge for me in Chersonese is when winter came. It got so cold, and I had none of the clothes needed to survive the cold, that I was just constantly dying or losing health. Actually, it was Brevon who was dying the most. But
like we said, survival mechanics within all of these, and that really helps increase the stakes while exploring these lands. Each of these regions, like we said, has about 5 to 10 locations scattered about. Now, all of these locations are spread very far apart, no matter what region you're in, and you're going to have to do a whole lot of running. trudging, as me and Nate like to refer to it. Once you're low on stamina, you have a very hefty stamina bar. It's gonna last you for a while, but it takes a pretty decent amount of time to recharge as well. And you're gonna be doing a lot of running. To go across an entire region takes a good amount of time, and that's one of the reasons it's a good game in co-op, that you can conversate and talk about, with the way the map system works. This is actually one of the more interesting things in the game. There is no marker where you are on the map, and there's no quest markers. You can't place any marker on the map. There's a compass, and you have a partner if you're playing co-op, and you can just check the map and look for landmarks and locations to sort of coordinate yourself and try to figure out where you're going. It really makes it a lot of fun playing with another person, trying to figure out where to go, as well as talking about finding other things. And with these survival mechanics and that in between all these locations, you might, like Nathaniel was talking about, you might have to deal with frost, and then you might get a cold and you have to deal with that. Or you might get a fight, you might find an enemy on the path in your way, or you might find some treasure. While you're doing a lot of running between all these locations, it's not just nothing in between them. You're managing these survival mechanics and trying to figure out where to go.
I must say that is also one of the plus sides to the designs of the game, is when you're running, it's not a bland landscape to be looking at. Definitely gives some good opportunity to talk about how the different stuff looks. And then it also makes it to where you kind of gotta look at it a little bit more, since between the gaps where you're not running into enemies or having to go in your inventory and try to stop yourself from dying of a cold or things like that, you're gonna be able to look at a lot and not really have something stopping you from looking around. But
and that's what the game's about. You're going on these long walks and journeys just to get to these amazing destinations, to get to the next one and the next one, and just see all these amazing places and overcome these challenges, whether they be enemies or environmental. Even within the dungeons and caves, you might have poison water or traps. You might get sick, and then you have to craft yourself some tea or something. There's just a lot of things you might have to deal with, a lot of survival mechanics within that.
Such as in the desert, you have to worry about heat a lot. It actually caused me to strip off my armor that was giving me a lot of buffs. So it made me a little bit more vulnerable, but it was necessary to not start overheating, which can deal damage at high progression or can just give a debuff at lower progression. But
that's one of the really cool things that works, and that all of these, exploration and combat are hand in hand in this game. The loops run within the loops. It's a Venn diagram. There's while you're running and while you're trying to go in between these destinations, you're losing stamina. You might be losing health from being cold or getting a disease, and you might get a debuff. And then whenever you reach this location, this dungeon, wherever you may be going, you're gonna have to deal with that. And so right when you're in town, before you leave, once you figure out where you're going, you have to plan this out. You have to prepare, or you're gonna end up dead. You're gonna end up not in a good situation.
Where you run up to a Wendigo and have no more stamina left because you
exactly
made a long journey to it.
You can't even swing your weapon. There's planning. It's not for everybody, but it makes every journey memorable.
For sure.
Like, I remember when me and Nate first started playing it, this was probably, I think, 2 years ago at least. I decided to drink the seawater, the ocean water, in the first town, and that is very salty. So my character got indigestion. I forget what the exact debuff was, but it gave a debuff to my character. And so on our journey to get out of dead as well, me and Nate, we had to just try to figure out, what do we need to get fix this man's indigestion.
At first we just started doing random stuff. and then finally
Yeah, drinking
we
random
found out
things.
what we need, and it took forever to find bitter, spicy tea
Yeah.
to fix the indigestion. That became a mini quest of itself, honestly.
And that's one thing that the game really does well. It's not it's sort of, in games like Ark or these big survival games that are just set in sort of empty, randomly generated worlds. You hear the developers talking a lot about the stories you create on your own rather than the game story. And this game does that, but it's like very fine-tuned, handcrafted versions of that. You have all these little stories of your own that are within this handcrafted world and more guided experience. More guided than something like Ark or something extremely sandbox, of course. It's not gonna hold your hand. It's still, you still have to figure most things out. It's not your AAA Skyrim or something like that. It's not, like we said, there's no quest markers, there's nothing like that. You have to remember these things. The first time you visit every region, you feel sort of helpless, like it's above your level, like you really shouldn't be trying to fight anything that's in there, at least until you make it to the first city, or maybe maybe the last region you go to, you feel like you could take on those enemies. But going back to the way they're designed, did you want to touch on any more of that before we headed more towards the survival elements?
Yeah, Enmerker Forest, its design, I mean, as far as art design, we already talked about that with it being a redwood forest, but when you first enter in from Chersonese, the area's a bit more flat with some gradual slopes and drops, but it's quite a bit more open and flat at first, and then you hit a really big lake, and it kind of forces you to go across some man-made bridges to get across that lake. But as soon as you get to the other side, all of a sudden the big open flat area turns into ravines where you're almost forced to walk down a few of the certain paths, which kind of bottlenecks you into enemies often.
Yeah, there's usually bandits or deer
Witches
on the road, witches.
Then, should you cut that out?
It'll be fine. So then moving past Enmerker, we'll head up to the swamp. That's the last region, the region we haven't discussed. There's dinosaurs, as well as when you first go into it, you're going to be faced with a large force field type magical thing that's going to be blocking you from the rest of the island, and you'll have to go through this passage in this large ziggurat thing that looks sort of like a pyramid.
As soon as you get out of that, though, the region opens up a bit more since nothing's going to be blocking your way, but the swamp is one of the most treacherous areas in the whole game. To stay out of the poisonous, toxic water that will give you practically a lasting debuff that will kill you if you don't get an antidote, you need to stay on the land bridges that connect different parts of the swamp. It's almost like a maze in the way it's laid out. It's really easy to get turned around since you'll be forced to make a few twists and go along the curves of the land. It's really easy to start looking a different direction than you meant. And occasionally there's random areas where the elevation just changes very quickly.
Yeah,
it forces you to go along a path to get up to the top sometimes, or sometimes you can brave it and just drop right off the top.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. In the swamp, there is a strange sense of elevation that it's in. I suppose Chersonese has the hills, and they all do have their sense of elevation. It's just exemplified with the maze-like structure, because all the other regions are very open. They're an open desert, Kentucky-style hills with a mountain in the middle, Chersonese, and then a big forest that's relatively open and not too narrow, except in some of its later areas, like you said, there are some tight ravines in there. But the swamp itself is very tight, very maze-like. And yeah, I think you summed it up pretty well. We can talk about the survival elements in the swamp as well. We've already touched on them with some of the environmental things, like the poison water in the swamp and the cold and the heat. And
I think we should start talking about the food, water, and the sleep.
yeah, you'll need to eat. You'll need to drink. You'll need to sleep. There is a magic system in the game which you will have to travel through the world. You don't start with it. You have to travel to a certain place to get that magic. Sacrifice your health and stamina to receive it. But talking about sleep, within this food, water, and sleep, of course you have to drink. Of course you have to eat. That's simple enough. Find food, find water. But when it comes to sleep, the mages have a special thing when it comes to sleep to increase your max mana or keep it at its maximum. That you need to not sleep. You need to be an insomniac, as well as drinking alcohol will increase your mana. And this is just fun. I mean, who doesn't love insomniac drunken wizards?
Yeah, so now you got a bunch of sleep-deprived alcoholics that can shoot fireballs at you.
And in our playthrough, that was Nate. Nate was an alcoholic insomniac wizard. Well, not insomniac, he actually slept a lot.
Yeah, gotta drink that Gaberry wine, though.
But getting into sleeping, there's a little more depth with sleeping. You have a chance to 1 to 100%, of course, but to be ambushed, and you'll need to set guarding hours between either you or your partner while you sleep. You have to sleep at the same time throughout those hours. You can get different qualities of tents and to sleep in, and some might give you better cover so you don't get ambushed. Some might give you more, keep you from losing your maximum mana.
Some are just for rich people who like to get the most comfort out of their sleep.
And there's also different environmental status effects. Usually have some kind of cure, being a tea. There's multiple different types of tea, and then of course there's antidotes for the poison. And that's really where it goes with the environmental effects. There's just enough of them to keep you on your toes really throughout the whole experience and keep you looking for things. Because to make these teas, to make these little healing potions as well, you're going to need these ingredients you'll find, and there's a crafting system. It's fairly basic, fairly simple. Find a recipe, or just start mixing shit together. With the crafting.
One thing that I actually did really like about it, though, is when it comes to the crafting, it's not all in just one menu, though there's quite a lot that you can do just in your normal crafting menu. You also need to have a cooking pot if you want to cook certain foods, and you can still cook some things, though really crappy food, without one. But if you want to start making the really good stuff that gives you good buffs, you want to have a cooking pot for sure. Sometimes also you can make recipes that aren't necessarily something you can get in the game.
Mixing shit together.
Yeah, you can just mix shit together until
throw it in a pot.
Until you get a good enough meal out of it. But then there's the alchemy lab. First, though, you want to set up a fireplace. Then you can select in your menu, place it down over top the fire. But when it comes to alchemy, you need to make sure you have the right ingredients. Always have at least some water. And then start mixing shit together.
Gravel beetles and
blood mushrooms.
Those are your best friend right there, healing potions.
Yep.
But you can find recipes all over the world, and you'll find your ingredients. But one thing, I'll probably go into it a little bit more once we get into combat and some of the equipment you're going to be using. But the economy around most things, around your equipment and the ingredients and survival items you get, it's pretty tight. You don't ever... I'm sure there's exploits. I'm sure there's easy ways to make money, you know. I'm sure you could find a video right now on YouTube that can tell you how to make $1 million in Outward. But in general, I think the average player will find it pretty difficult to get a ridiculous amount of money. The economy's pretty tight. You don't feel like you're and with two players, you never feel like you have an overabundance of equipment of survival gear. You always feel like you're just scraping by. You just even into the late game, you have just enough health potions. You have just enough food, or maybe you feel like you don't even quite have enough. You're just scraping by the skin of your teeth.
For sure. Um, would you like to move into the combat?
Okay, so before moving on to the combat, there's a few more things in exploration I wanted to talk about. But before I even say that, I just want to say that this half of the video, we're recording this at a different time. And due to certain circumstances, we're now recording it remotely through Discord. And so the audio quality, especially on Nathaniel, might be a little bit different, may end up being a little bit worse. But we'll just see how it goes. We need to get the video out, and we still are going to have a good discussion here. So, finishing up with the exploration, Nathaniel. I just wanted to say we focused mainly on all the positives. Before we got into combat, real quick, I want to talk about a little bit of some of the negatives there. Especially, we played through the entire game co-op. I said earlier that this is what the review is a co-op review. It's not really focused on the single player. But just throwing it in there, playing single player, the long, and even sometimes in the multiplayer, the long journeys between everything all the time can bog it down sometimes. I mean, it's what it's about, but it usually comes in the quests that end up sending you back to a place you've already been to, in an area you've already explored most of. In the latter half of the story, it seemed to do this a lot, and it just really wasn't fun running across these large areas that we'd seen everything. You know what I'm saying?
I actually had a good time going back into Chersonese after getting towards the end of the game, especially because winter hit Chersonese and it kind of changed up the landscape a bit. We had to worry about the cold way more, and it was honestly a really good time having to revive you every 10 seconds because you were dying of the cold so often, and then having to build like 3 campfires next to each other to try to stay warm while I make some tea to cure our illnesses.
Yeah, and I agree. Those the little stories in between or during your travels keep that keep even going to the same areas.
I would say
interesting.
that in single player, though, that could actually become way more tedious because you're not going to have another person there to, conversate with, and it'll all be on you to carry every single item. So you'll probably have way less inventory space, and the journey would probably be a lot harder and more serious.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's the things that are. That's one reason the game is so good in co-op. Is things that would be tedious and boring in single player end up being way more interesting and made into some of the most fun moments in multiplayer. But going back to the fact that winter came to Chersonese, and that changed up a bit of our the situation, the whole situation. Just we had to worry about the cold, and we weren't quite prepared, so I kept dying. But I don't think there were enough things like that across.
In other regions, they didn't really change.
That's the only environment.
The game, like none of the other regions seem to have seasons, and going across that swamp so many times and through the Enmerker forest so much was kind of a little bit tedious. I mean, there was a few locations that we hadn't visited, and then when we finally decided to...
Yeah, that's true, especially in the swamp. But yeah, the long traveling can get tedious at times, but overall, I would definitely say the exploration is a positive, and in co-op, it's definitely one of the most fun parts of the experience, and probably the core of the experience, especially in co-op.
Yeah,
So do
I'm
you want to move
down
on to
for moving
combat?
on to combat.
All right, so we've got a third-person combat system. It's somewhat similar to Dark Souls, although it's also very different. It uses a stamina bar and dodge rolls with invincibility frames, but with it's focused on exploration and survival elements. There's the stamina bar is a much longer term management thing. It recharges a lot slower than something like Dark Souls because it's about planning it out. You need to figure out, do I have enough stamina for the journey to this place, and then to do to explore this dungeon and fight things. And then when you come out of it, you look at your stamina bar, you look at how much of your max stamina you have, and you're just like, can we go here? Can we go here? Do we have the supplies and the ability to continue with these places, or should we go back and to town or something? And there's sleep, and there's a lot of long-term management like that, like we talked about with the survival elements and the exploration.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to be caught with your pants down
combat
with no stamina and running into some tough enemies,
right?
Or else you can't even swing your weapon if
Absolutely.
you're out of stamina completely. So you definitely need to be mindful of that and keep your eyes open for any enemies that could be on your path. Thankfully, though, if you make a long journey and get to a dungeon, you can sleep right outside the dungeon and get your stamina actually to be full again.
And in that, we could talk something about I probably would have touched on more in the exploration section, but it's fine to touch on it here. I just forgot about it. The guarding system, the ambushes when you sleep. If you sleep in an unsafe area, you have a percentage chance to get ambushed to basically be forced awake by something attacking you. And while this would be probably more interesting to manage in a single player sense, or in a single player game, in multiplayer it is a little bit trivial. You don't really ever feel like you can't guard 100%,
and even besides, most enemies that sneak up on you usually aren't super difficult most of the time. They've just been bandits and hyenas. Haven't had any fire deer just wake us in the night.
Absolutely. But continuing though with the combat again, it's definitely we're going to start talking about this is where we start going towards the less strong aspects of the game. The art design and the exploration are what hold this game up so high to be such a fantastic game. And the combat is not bad at all, but it's much more about having all these different ways to approach combat. That's what it does really good, is you have a lot of different ways to approach things. You have a lot of different combat styles, and due to some of the systems, you can only use a few of these styles with your character, and which works well for setting up sort of freeform classes you can make for yourself when you have two players. And you can have, like you were this wizard and I was more of a rogue type character, and we sort of played off each other pretty well.
There is something that we haven't touched on before with there being the max stamina, max magic, and max health that gets lowered over time if you don't tend to your needs. You can end up having a cap on your stamina.
Yeah, and that comes in with the combat. and that definitely affects the combat a
Yeah.
lot. Like, if you don't take care of that, you don't sleep or drink your potions to recharge those maximum stamina, health, and mana, you can really screw yourself over. Sorry, I burped. But yeah, you can really be screwed over in a fight if you have low max health and stamina. I
Yeah,
think of
where
a
we
few
were down
times where
to
we were.
maybe having like quarter health available to us because our max health had gone down so far, and almost no stamina. And then I had like no magic left either.
But let's continue on with just the basics of combat. Their stamina bar, like we said, there's melee and a little bit of ranged and magic. There's a stealth system, kind of. It's not something I would rely on much, but it can help you get around some enemies. There's you get 8 quick slots. You can put skills or any type of item in, and it limits your choices while giving you a decent amount of choice.
I actually liked
how you
the
do
quick
things.
slot aspect of a lot of games, especially Outward, because I think it's a good way to do a lot of the magic. Instead of like in Skyrim, you have to go into a menu and select a new thing, like pausing the game when you go into that menu.
Yeah, and with the co-op, that would really, you can't pause the game, every time you get into combat or in the middle of combat. So that would really narrow down what your abilities are as a whole, what you can use in combat. So the quick slots,
I would say that's another benefit
and
of co-op, though, for sure, is that one person can sometimes give you the time to switch out quick slots by getting enemies on them, and then also having 2 people, that's double the amount of abilities.
And there is some scaling there. There is some enemy health being raised and their damage output being raised, but it is overall an easier game co-op. But it's far from easy even in co-op. It's still definitely
we sure die a lot.
Yeah, that's for sure. But the third-person combat, it is a bit clunky. There's this the impact system where every character has an impact bar, sort of like poise. I think that's what's called in Sekiro. I can't remember. It's what's called in Dark Souls. And when weapons do damage as well as impact damage, and the impact damage will take down that impact bar. And once it's emptied, the enemies will be staggered, knocked down, and then you can really get some hits in on them. And it feels good. It feels decent, but there's definitely just a clunkiness to the whole thing. A ramshackle feel.
I think they have
almost.
A lot of interesting mechanics built in with having the impact system in there, but I definitely feel like there's just kind of some room for improvement on a lot of that stuff. Like,
I think there's a bit of stiffness in the animations,
and then
they just feel a little rigid.
Definitely could upgrade the AI or add more kind of like attacks, different styles that enemies come at you, but they kind of all just rush right at you.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking about getting into. The enemy AI is very Bethesda-esque, for lack of a better term. It just runs at you swinging, and there is a little bit ranged enemies are obviously going to hang back a little bit and shoot you, but it's overall very, very basic. And like we said, 10 guys, made this game, so it's really not. It's not surprising, and it doesn't. It brings down the game at the play a little bit, but there's so many distinct enemy types, and they all have very distinct attacks that you have to learn, and there's a lot of different styles of things that you have to look out for, a lot of different styles of weapons and magic. There's all the different elements when it comes to all your choices in combat, and played against all the enemies types and choices they have. It really becomes something interesting, though, and something pretty damn good. I
they
would say
sure
as
do
well.
have a lot of very interesting variety of enemies that each have their own unique attack types. I would say that those sometimes do get a little bit overshadowed by the AI not being the best, since they'll all still attack in relatively the same way. It's just some of
Right.
their attacks have like a wider range, or some of them have like take the fire deer for instance. Its attack was pretty far
Yeah,
like
with the
out from
tracking
its
fireballs.
body, even though it's a melee attack, and it makes a really
Right.
wide sweep all in one. So some of those enemies
And I would
have interesting
sometimes the
attack styles.
yeah, I would agree, but sometimes the combat also does feel a bit unfair, like maybe you really shouldn't have got hit, or the enemy
Yeah.
sort of tracks
Other
you.
times you can just run in a circle to their left and they can't hit you at all.
Right, right. Another problem is they focus
Definitely.
very much on the host, and then they just sort of focus on
Now,
whoever's doing
there
more
is
damage.
one
Uh,
enemy though that I do believe has a better AI in general. It could just be how the AI matches up with their attack styles, but the Lich actually did have pretty good AI. It knew when to get close and when to be
yeah,
ranged.
the Lich.
Yeah, that
That thing was
thing
tearing us up, though.
destroyed us.
But it didn't really, with that fight, it didn't really
Yeah.
feel unfair. Especially during our first fight, like it felt like, okay,
Yeah.
this is what we're doing wrong. We can, if we play better, we can
And there was also a
easily
lot of
take this thing out. But
build up. Like, that's not just a low tier enemy that's somehow whooping you for no real reason. It's a high tier enemy that
right, right.
is actually optional. And it really has a good aesthetic to it when you get up to that point.
Um, and I will say, as you get later in, there's a lot more difficult animations to play against with the weapons, like the like telekinetic swords
Yeah.
of the one creature in the swamp, and the gun from the Lich's minions, and then their large swords. It's more erratic. It's harder
Yeah.
to predict the angle that and the animation of which they're going to attack with. But moving on from the basics of combat, we can take a look at some of the skill system. Like we said, you have 8 quick slots. We played on an Xbox. You would use the trigger and was the deep note.
Yeah.
You'd use the trigger and a certain button, and that would allow you to use this quick slot. And the way skills work in Outward, magic are also skills. Although to get access to a mana bar, you have to go to a certain area. You don't have that from the beginning of the game. But the way skills work, you don't have, you don't level up. You don't gain experience. You just will have to buy your skills, learn them from trainers within cities, and this helps that economy I was talking about remain tighter as well, because you have to pay for your skills. You might have to think, do I want to get food? Do I want to get potions? Do I want to get a skill? or maybe I want that new weapon or armor I've been looking at. And that's an interesting thing. It's sort of like Dark Souls, where its souls are also used as its currency. It's a bit
Yeah, I
of a
remember
reverse on that.
when we'd go into towns
But
that initially, when we were still buying skills and a lot of our initial gear, that we'd both go different directions and come back and show our badass things that we just bought. Like, I think you showed off the
yeah,
thing where you jump and slam down on the ground on an enemy. Then I showed off my runes that I was casting.
yeah, the it's from the Wild
Yeah,
Hunter.
I, that was always a good time.
Um, and one thing I want to touch on is the breakthrough points. So every trainer has what, like 5 or so skills, maybe. I don't know. They have a selection of skills, handful of skills, and half of those, maybe less, maybe a third, are available um, to anybody. But to reach the other 2/3, to gain those skills, you need to spend a breakthrough point. And at the beginning of the game, you have 3 of these, and those are the only 3 you're going to have through the entire game. And this is. It's a bit of a problem, but it's also something I would never take out of the game. Maybe rework a little bit.
I
Because
thought that it
Nate.
was pretty okay. I mean, initially I didn't understand it until after I used up all my breakthrough points and was sad that I couldn't go and get more magic skills. But I thought that it wasn't too bad of a system because it kind of makes sure that you don't become the well-rounded good guy, that you instead have to kind of go into a class that you get to make out of those 3 breakthrough skills or skill trees
Which works well with
for
the
sure.
the co-op, because you can have 2 very distinct classes of characters. And another thing is, it makes sure you don't. I don't know. This could be seen as a positive or a negative. It depends on who you are, and it makes sure you don't end up playing the meta build on your very first time
And
through. You pick a few of these breakthrough points, and then you're sort of forced to create a build around what you have chosen, especially if you didn't realize. But one thing I will just say right now to all of you is, yeah, you have 3 breakthrough points through the whole game. Do use them carefully. Spend them
I think that
sparingly.
also does a pretty good job uh at kind of like making the role playing work. So you can't be like a master
Right.
wizard and a master swordsman and a master hunter, master assassin, all these things all at the same time. Kind of like
Right. You could be
Skyrim,
a
where
decent amount
you
of
could
things.
be everything at once. This game kind of forces you to
Right.
uh kind of choose what you want to be, but then also that kind of leads to higher replayability as well, because then you might want to play again with different skill
Yeah, and I
set.
think that's something this game does have is good replayability. Um, so let's talk about a little bit more specifics of the skills themselves. So you have trainers. There's, I think, 5 or 6 trainers throughout the world that all have different skill trees. From the mage skill trees, the runic mage, the philosopher, the wild hunter, the warrior monk are some examples of some of the characters. I was a rogue type character. I used the warrior monk, the wild hunter, and the Kazite spellblade, whereas Nate was a wizard and he used mainly runic magic. And you want to talk a little bit about the runic magic
Yes, the
system, Nate?
runic magic system is really interesting with you needing to cast at least 2 runes to make a combination, and that is what makes the spell. Say, like, you use green and purple. I don't remember if this is the actual spell combo, but green and purple, and you drop a magic
Right.
trap because you used the green and purple runes. And then you could use 2 of the runes in a combination to make a lantern. And then if you continued in that skill tree, you could make combinations where, while having one spell activated, like the rune lantern, you could then cast another spell that could like shoot a lightning ball. And there's all sorts of combinations that come with that. You can conjure swords, you can lay the traps and detonate the traps, you can give yourself armor and then heal with that. There's really a lot of stuff you could do with it, but to make one of the combinations, you need to cast one rune and then cast another rune within the next few seconds. It only lasts a few seconds before it goes away, so you have to make sure to use 2 in succession in the correct order.
Right, if you use one rune, nothing happens, and the runic magic system isn't the only system, the magic system that works this way in the game. Almost all the magic in the game works this way, where you need to combine 2 different spells or abilities to create these, or 2 different abilities to create these spells.
Except for my favorite spell, the flamethrower. Absolutely best spell.
But you do need to combine 2 different things for that, right? The sparks and the lantern.
I think that you just have to have the lantern in your inventory, but yeah, you do need the spell. Well, not in your inventory, in hand specifically. And then you just can spray fire out of it. But that is also interesting because if you can get a different kind of lantern, then you can get a different kind of fire.
Oh, and by the way, we haven't played for a little while. We beat the game. I got an electric lantern, and I'm curious to see how that would work.
Yeah, I'd like to see that.
Or if it would work. Like, I wonder if we could shoot lightning.
For sure.
We're going to be doing a video on the DLC. Maybe we'll let you guys know how that works out during that video. But continuing with the skills system. The magic actually isn't the only thing that uses these combinations, though. My 2 melee skill systems needed to have these passive buff abilities active in order to use my combat abilities. So in one slot I had Enrage, which is a passive buff that will make my character deal more damage, I believe. And to use my 2 slotted combat abilities, which was a Leap, where I would slam down with my one-handed weapon, and then long, like just 2 swings with my one-handed weapon. And to use those, I needed to have this Rage boon active. And so there's an interesting thing there. My guy needed to be pissed off to attack, and there was a similar thing with my other class, and so it just, I find it interesting. I think it works well to have to combine all these different things. It makes you feel more like you're learning things, you're doing things, especially with the magic. You feel like you're casting spells and not like you're just clicking one button to do it. It makes it.
And I also
more
feel like
interesting
it creates almost like way more possibilities than just use this one spell and one thing happens. But when you do all the combination things, then there's a lot of possibilities you can get with those different spells and abilities. But on top of the rune magic, by the way, another example that I remember of mixing spells is spells that take souls that you have to collect with soul magic, and then spells that you can only cast after casting a sigil on the ground and standing in that sigil.
And you need a item, a heat or cold stone or something like that to place these sigils. And so that adds another layer to that. And there's also wind magic, which you need to travel to a certain area in each region, which has this tower of wind, and you need to discover that before you can use these top tier wind magic spells in that area. And so it's each one of these skill trees just has something unique to it, and there's an overall very large level of creativity in all these skill trees, and you have the ability to create like many different types of characters. There's archery, there's one-handed weapons, there's rogue stuff, there's traps, there's magic, multiple kinds we've talked about. And even past these skill trainers with full skill trees, there's these trainers that will train singular skills. And most of those are skills you will use with certain weapon types. And such as with my mace, I could block I had an ability where I could block an attack, and then my mace would gain whatever element that attack had, whether it be fire, ice. Now my mace has that on it, and I actually didn't find that to be that useful, because if you're getting attacked with fire, you don't really need to attack that thing with fire. You want to use ice. But the interesting thing there is that each of these weapon types has its own unique ability. And when it comes to weapon types and the equipment you're going to be using in combat, I think there's a wide variety of it that, again, just like the skills, offers a lot of different choice at how you go into these combat situations. There's you have, like, I use the one-handed weapons, and in that there's maces, axes, swords, and Nate, you had two-handed weapons and magic, so you could have used a number of things.
Longsword, lances, broad axes, and I believe there was one more, but I can't remember specifically what it was. Stabs, I think, just get recategorized into either axe or halberds. But kind of weird choice on their part to make those categorized as word, but still, I think it works pretty well, especially since the stabs give buffs to make sure that casting spells doesn't cost as much.
Right, and the armor as well has a good variety to it. Some good. There's the heat defense and cold defense, as well as just regular defense and resistances, as well as something like your mage's hat.
What was the actual other than damage resistance? There was another thing that was symbolized with the low shield. And what did that do specifically?
You know what? I'm genuinely not sure. I never really understood the difference between
I just know it was a good thing,
protection.
so always grab those. If you're gonna be the
right. Probably
guy who takes all the damage.
But right.
There was one thing I wanted to add, by the way, to the magic. I know we talked about the magic a lot, but I think that it sounds a little daunting at first to have all these like prereqs you need to be able to cast these spells, but I actually think it does a really good service for the overall world building, because it makes it feel like magic,
right, and there's
whereas most games it's just another weapon practically. They're like, most games have lost the mysticism type feel behind magic, where it's like you're unraveling the mysteries of the metaphysical planes or whatever. But
the arcane
in
arts,
this game,
right.
having to go to the wind cabals, that's like, that actually makes it feel like you're some kind of wizard.
Right, journeying for this knowledge, but like you said, it's not as daunting as it seems. There's only like 3 magic skill trees, and but each one of those feels very interesting and important and has a lot you can do with it. It's very quality over quantity with
And a
this game
weapon
as a
type
whole.
that we didn't bring up
Uh,
so far has been chakrams.
you want to talk about the
Is a
offhands?
chakram an offhand?
Yeah, there's a decent amount of offhands. You got the chakrams, which are these. The only other thing I've seen them in is Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, which is a bit of a lesser known action RPG. They're these discs, and you'll throw them, and it's like a boomerang. It's a bladed disc. You
Yeah,
just throw it, and
interesting
it
choice
kills things.
of a weapon. It actually comes from around India, I believe. They're
Absolutely.
in real life much smaller, and people kind of fling them off their fingers at people. In this, they have a handle in the center,
Right,
like
it's not
you're
gonna
the
come back to you.
Predator from uh, Predator Universe or Alien
Right.
Universe, and kind of throw it out like a frisbee. But doesn't that have some kind of way of working with wind magic?
No, that's the Philosopher skill tree. That's one of the. It's not wind magic. It's something to do with followers of Elot, but the whole thing is. I don't even believe you can use it without these spells, these
So
abilities.
there is kind of a bit of a
Uh,
overlap with spells though with the chakrams.
yeah, absolutely. I don't even think you can use it without having the abilities from
It's a
the
very
skill tree.
interesting choice in a weapon. It definitely
And
feels
it
uh well, we've used this word a lot, unique.
Yeah. Continuing with these unique offhands, you have, well, one of the least unique. You have a dagger, which I used in my offhand, and you have a bleeding attack you can get with it. There's a poison skill you can gain with it, and as well you have guns, flintlock style pistols you can have in your offhand. And we didn't find them to be too useful, but we didn't have any abilities for them, and we didn't really try to use them that
Yeah.
much. It wasn't really our focus.
We and also we
But
didn't
not an
get the
offhand, but you have
best. We
bows.
didn't get the best of the pistols either. We kind of used pretty simple ones at first. And I think
Right.
one upgrade into it, we stopped using the pistols because we're already a little spread thin on the amount of different weapon types and skills we were using at the point we picked those up.
Right, and going back to your rune magic that you used, there's another offhand weapon that you're going to be using
A
with that.
lexicon.
The what was it?
But if you gain a
Right.
certain skill, you don't need to hold the lexicon to cast spells.
And that brings up another very important point: is in these ability trees, these skill trees. At the very end, you're going to be offered two different skills, and you can only pick one. And that offers two very differing play styles. Like you said, the Nate internalized his lexicon, so he didn't need to carry this book in his offhand, so he could use a two-handed halberd while he cast his spells. Whereas, do you remember exactly what the other option
I
was?
don't think that I do.
It I think it's something to do with making
Yeah,
them stronger or
it was gonna
take
be
less
another
mana, something like
passive.
that. But it's just an interesting evolution to the skill and the combat there. Um, and with all these equipment, you can also craft them, just like your food and your potions. So you can craft some things by finding recipes and just opening there's crafting menu, and you can craft them absolutely anywhere just by finding these things and these recipes. And there's some really good weapons you can make by doing that, and they don't take like you're not going to be out gathering forever. They're rare materials rather than a lot of materials. And the other way you're going to be crafting things is in each town there are special blacksmiths that can craft specific types of armors. And in our experience, we found more of our loot, and it seemed to be, to us at least, the loot we found would usually outpace what we could craft.
Yeah, I feel
Would you
like
agree with that,
we
Nate?
didn't go into the crafting on our gear nearly as much. I know that that is how I got the second tier pistol, but then, as I said before, I stopped using it. But I do believe that one of the
Right.
halberds I used for much of the early game was crafted from using bones and a iron halberd, of which also most of the weapons need to start
And there's that
off
interesting,
as iron, which is usually cheap and you can buy. You usually, like, I don't think you can craft from nothing to make a iron one, but if you buy the iron version of whatever weapon you want to craft, you just keep upgrading it almost through tiers.
okay, and you'll further,
Like, I
okay,
could then
interesting,
upgrade my bone
interesting.
halberd into a higher tier other kind of halberd. I can't remember what the upgrade was specifically. Sometimes though, you
Right,
actually
right.
start off from another weapon, like non-iron, that you have to buy in the later tiers. You don't keep on upgrading through the tiers completely. It's almost like there's two
Okay, well
chains
that's
of upgrading your weapons, and one's a later game.
That's really interesting. I didn't interact with the equipment crafting system very much. I felt like, the weapons I found were outpacing the crafting weapons, but I'm glad that you remembered all that, because that's actually a very interesting system, and it's another
Yeah.
thing I really like the
I
way
do
they did it.
think with how you said that the materials, you're looking for more rare rather than a quantity of materials. Um, that is kind of one of the things that
Right.
made us not use crafting as much, because one of the tiers we would need required materials that we only just recently found with the lich boxes, the little gold lich boxes. That was actually needed, I believe, to upgrade the
And
pistol to the next tier.
the weapons we're using to kill these creatures, or the weapons you need to kill these lich creatures, are better than the weapon you're creating with these lich boxes. I feel
Yeah,
like,
I feel like if we would have initially, instead of going through the whole game like in that swamp, if we would have just fought a few of the lich creatures, we would have had enough to make the lich tier that that uh, we
I think
outpaced.
they might have just wrecked us.
Uh, um, I don't know, maybe. But then again, I think you already had the blue mace and red dagger before we even went into the swamp. So we might have gotten our
Yeah, that's true.
top tier gear way earlier than what they probably meant us to. But
Um, so that's actually a good place to go in talking about that spire that we visited to take out some of these liches. Um, Finishing off with the combat, we can talk about the dungeon design. We already talked about, art style wise, aesthetically, gorgeous, unique. But talking mechanically, they're pretty large, most of them. Usually pretty well designed. There's sometimes it can be easy to get lost in them, especially without you have
yeah,
no map. But usually the living enemies will be your guide to where the next place to go is. There's
or corpses to
some
backtrack.
unique puzzle. Right, right. There's some unique puzzle aspects to them. Nothing too complicated, but it's definitely more complicated than like match the picture Skyrim
Yeah,
puzzles.
it doesn't take much to be more complicated
Uh,
than that.
that's true. That's true. Kindergarten is more complicated than that. But there's maybe too much of a focus on levers that you just sort of find and pull,
Definitely.
and then you're like, oh, that did this. Now
Especially
let's go over
when,
here.
like,
But
they use levers for, I think, all of the puzzles that we've actually done. Like, to turn on teleporters was using levers. To open gates and close gates is using
that's
levers.
true.
I think they kind of overdid it with those,
You
but
know what?
still.
We may have been wrong. It may be easier than match the
I
picture.
don't know.
Find the lever
No,
may be
find the
easier than
lever,
match the picture.
see what it does, then realize it's actually closing another gate behind the one you're trying to open. That was one of our problems one time. I remember
okay,
when we were
that's
trying to
true.
flip 3 different levers to figure out the puzzle.
And I remember a time with the levers where they would move train
Oh
cars
yeah, I forgot about
inside
that.
of this cave. And we had
One
to
of
figure out
us
some
had to
things with
try to
that.
dodge roll on top of it as it moved that one time, instead of... I think we found
Yeah.
out it was way simpler than that, though, in the end. Because it obviously isn't something
and
you could do
there's-
single player if one guy's gotta flip it.
Right. And there's a lot of interesting hidden things, I feel like, in each of those dungeons. Like, I most of the time, I felt when we got to the end of those dungeons, I was like, did we miss something? Like, there's something... I never felt like we'd fully explored them, and that's positive and
For
negative,
sure.
in my
I
opinion.
remember not too long ago in the dinosaur
Like-
cave, it literally was you barely
Yeah.
turn and you'd miss a doorway that leads to another large part of the cave.
And that adds to the replayability, that adds to the sense of adventure and discovering things that other people haven't, or that you might had not before. But it also is like you can miss a lot, and if you're a person that wants to see everything a game has to offer, but wants to do it in a reasonable amount of time,
You definitely aren't
might be
just
an
going to
issue
be
for you.
going through the motions to find everything in a dungeon.
right?
I do think that the dungeons layouts, though, are pretty good, as they make sense with the area and setting of the dungeon. Like, caves are going to be a lot of winding paths and small doorways that lead to larger chambers, things like that.
And there's a good variety of, like we talked about this in the art design, there's a good variety of aesthetics within each of these dungeons. There's a lot of different places you're going to be going to. It's not like, we keep bringing up Elder Scrolls, we keep harping on them, but like Oblivion or Fallout 3, that's not Elder Scrolls, but Bethesda, Fallout 3 had its great infrastructure with factories and metro stations, and it felt like repeats a lot. And we see that even today. We see that with Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Valhalla, and trying to think. I don't know. I can't give it another example right now, but we see that a lot. That sort of copy paste. This is a different area, but it's not really a different area. And this Outward avoids that almost wholly. There are some very similar areas.
I mean, it's
caves,
hard to differentiate caves
similar
unless you make
dungeons, but
every cave a unique location that has some deep lore as to why it's so different. Like, you can't make every location the most spectacular thing, or else it'll make the spectacular ones not as important. Yeah, so, I mean, there's not a lot you can do on a cave, and there's not a lot you can do with some small ruins sometimes, but other than that...
But there is a lot
yes,
you can do with the
giant purple mountain.
And a giant
in every
mechanical
region
towers with lasers that bend time in a medieval setting.
I do know that like
Uh,
the Lich Tower,
but
I think, was the most unique that we'd seen. I feel like because it used different kind of assets than all
you're
the
probably right.
other castle-like buildings, and had a steampunky vibe. Even though all the enemies that we saw were magic,
Right, and
except for the
almost
one with the Gatling gun.
a grand wizard-esque library. And in the setting, though, we see there's a very strong combination with the technology and magic. Magic seems to be the way they've achieved
Yeah.
the technology in this
Um.
universe.
Then I do
Um,
remember that there is a bit of like, even though a lot of their dungeons are large, some of them on the outside look like they should be large, but not nearly as large as the building. Like, uh,
but I see the opposite as well,
but
though.
I was gonna bring up the one time when
Like
I think we got captured and we woke up in the one castle with the bandit. Yeah, the
the
fort.
fort,
And
the bandit fort.
I remember the outside of the building is this huge castle, but that one dungeon was relatively small, and most of it was underground.
But I also remember like the face of the ancients with
Oh,
the old
yeah.
man faces everywhere. It looked like this
And
tiny
then
cave
it
from the
becomes
outside.
a
And
fire
then you
deer
go in and
nest.
it's this huge deep network of right, and it's a network of tunnels
That
and
was actually really
so
good.
there's again, it's just a good variety and originality to the whole thing, but in each of these dungeons and the regions themselves, they really tell a story. They the lore overall, I think,
Yeah,
is
environmental
good at face value.
storytelling
Uh,
is definitely the strong suit of this game. Like, I'd say that about every
yeah.
game that I've seen, this one has probably the most.
I know you're not a Dark Souls guy. You
Dark
haven't played
Souls
that
kid,
series, and
but
I would
yeah,
say
I would.
they beat out.
I've heard.
They they definitely beat out, but it's a very similar
Yeah,
feeling I get. Although, as we'll talk about in a minute, they, unlike Dark Souls, the Outward really exposits at you at certain points
yeah,
and just tells you all this stuff. But there is enough said left unsaid, and I actually think the more that's said, though, the less interesting the setting is, I suppose. The more that the story and the plot actually just straight up tells you, the less interesting this world
I
becomes.
think it depends. I think that it's mainly their method of dropping exposition makes the exposition they drop way, way less interesting. But like, I usually
Okay.
like games that can go a bit deep in their lore, and I do also like the mystery element to some games where you don't know exactly why these things are the way they are. But um, I think games that have like the if you want to learn more about the world, you can by like investigating those type of choices are good. This game doesn't really add that. When it wants to give exposition in the story, it drops a load of it on you.
All right, and so since we're here, let's get it dive into this story. So I don't want to say it's a big steaming pile of crap, but it's not great, and like we said, the environmental storytelling and the overall lore is pretty damn good. It's unique. Once again, as we'll continue saying, it, it's it just brings its own thing to the table, which works well with the gameplay mechanics it
Like the
brings
world
to the
they
table.
built was really, really
But
good.
the actual,
Like amazing world.
absolutely, where you are, what you're doing, where you are is interesting. What you're doing is usually interesting, but why you're doing it is never really that interesting. So the game starts out, and you're a part of this tribe. Um, Minor spoilers, but we shouldn't. We're not gonna spoil all that much. We're not gonna go too deep into the story because it's not really all that interesting in my opinion. But uh, so you're part of this tribal group known as the Blue Circle Collective, sort of a just a tribal republic almost, made up of a council of these different tribes, and you owe $500 to the leader to your tribe. And I actually really like this setup. I like this beginning. Here's give us $500, or we're taking your fucking house. We're taking your house. Uh, and that's cool. It's go find a way to make
Yeah, very
$500
open.
for
It
in I think
definitely
3 or 5
gives
days,
a
one or the other.
good opportunity for role playing right there. How are you going to get the money?
But one thing the game does decently is consequences too, because if you don't get the money in 3 to 5 days, you will lose your house, which is a pretty good asset to
Initially,
have. It's a
the
pretty good thing
first
to have.
house was amazing because it's an actual place to store some of your stuff without losing it.
Yeah. And that's one thing that the plot does is you do have some choices. You do have and you do have less choices but more consequences for your actions rather than plain choices. You do have a choice as you get into the story. You'll get that $500, and then you'll be offered the ability to join 3 different factions. Although it's a bit unclear that you can join all 3 of them at the start, you may not realize. But we played through one of the factions, which I have heard just from just Reddit and some other things, that the Blue Circle Collective is the Blue Chamber Collective, excuse me, is the best faction, the most interesting faction storyline. And if that's true, yeah, oof.
Yeah. It's just like work towards this goal,
like I
and
said,
then get to the end, and then it doesn't matter at all.
yeah, I'm gonna spoil this a little bit.
It seemed like more stuff was going on in the background with the other faction choices.
Absolutely.
And when you finally make it to the end and you can see like some of the product of the other parts of the story we could have decided to do, I kind of really gotta wonder exactly if
yes,
what you read was true.
So yeah, full discretion. Maybe the other 2 factions. We joined the Blue Chamber Collective. Maybe the followers of Elot or Levant have better stories, more interesting stories. But from what I've heard, the Blue Chamber has the best, most interesting story. And if that's true, this story is the most anticlimactic, backwards thing I have ever experienced. It is just like, so the first half of the game, or the first third, let's say, you raise $500, and she's like, all right, go to the capital of our people. And you go to the capital, and she's like, okay, go back to where you just came from.
And then go back to the capital again.
Yes. Go back to where you just came from, and then you help them kill some bandits.
We did.
We probably already killed.
We went to the location and killed them prior to, and then had to go back again. And then later on, not gonna say why, but we went back another time to the same bandits, but didn't have to kill them.
Yes. And so after that, after you go back to the capital, so we went to the capital, went back to where we came from, killed some bandits that we'd already killed, and then we went back to the capital. And once we get there, before this, they've really been light on story. It's been more go here, go here, go here. Not too
Now
much
let's
reason,
drop the
rhyme or reason.
exposition.
And once we get back to the capital, we're like probably 10 or more hours into the game at this point, I feel like. And there's barely been any story other than the excellent environmental storytelling. And yeah, they just have a giant expedition dump. Just yeah, it's exposition dump. There's what, like 5 guys. They're all different tribes of this blue chamber, and they're just like, I'm from this. Yeah, there's like 10 of them. He's like, I'm from this tribe. We want
them
this.
Can drop a little bit of their own exposition,
and they just all try
and
to.
Then the main conversation drops a ton of it.
And then and you're just sitting there like, what is even going on? Do I even care at this point? And I will say, an interesting thing is that a lot of the things I had assumed through the environmental storytelling ended up being true, which I don't know if is more it's more a testament to the game's environmental storytelling than my.
Yeah, it was definitely cool when we saw those towers, those metal towers. We started like thinking up, why are there giant metal towers with blue crystals on top?
Yeah, and then we see the dead scourge beasts.
Yeah, and then scourge beasts. And we kind of had an idea of like, oh, these golems were fighting the scourge beasts to defend these towers for some reason. And that turned out all to be true.
Yeah. To help stop the scourge beasts. Yeah, that was really one of the more interesting things.
Storytelling throughout all of it.
And another thing, talking about the consequences. When we got sent back to, when she said, go back to Cierzo, go back to the first town, and we had to kill those bandits, even though technically we'd already killed them, they respawned. And if we wouldn't have killed them within like 5 or 7 days, something like that, the entire first town would have been destroyed and taken over by bandits. And that's cool. And this happens no matter what faction you join. So that's interesting. And there are a decent amount of those consequences to mostly time. Not necessarily. There's some that are from choices.
I would say that is one of the weaker parts of the game, is the only things that really seem to have a giant effect on the world is consequences for not doing a quest on time rather than choices. Whereas like games that we usually talk good about, like New Vegas, things like that, where like your choices, you see an effect in the world occasionally. There's a lot less of that in Outward, but if you make the choice to not do the quest on time, I guess,
I would definitely
then
agree.
There's a huge effect on the world. But that's the majority of effects that you see from your actions, and
right, other than
the main
other than
3
factions.
Yeah, that's
right,
kind of
and that
even choice.
Even picking a main 3 factions, even that choice though, like you're only deciding what part of the story you want to see. Like you're not changing the story, I don't think, by picking Elot. If you pick the followers of Elot, the same stuff is going to happen. You're just going to be
from a different perspective
for Elot in this story. Right, and that's so with the Blue Chamber Collective, the entire game, or like the last 2/3. Okay, excuse me. The first third is what we were just talking about earlier. And at the end of that is the large exposition dump. And so in the second third of the game, you are in this war with a certain group. And the entire second third is about building up to this war, building up your faction.
Alliance.
To fight in this war. And it really seems like it's building up to where, you know, the last third, or the last few missions, are going to be you fighting in this war, fighting to defeat the third one of these other factions. But what happens in the strangest choice I've ever seen for a story like this? After you build up all these alliances, you have to wait 3 days. She's like, I'll tell you what's going on in 3 days. After these 3 days, she tells you that the third faction that you can choose each of these 2 factions that are warring against each other now. But there's also a third faction that is led by a god, basically. And we're trying to stay vague, but this is getting a bit spoilery. Demands peace. And so everything you've just been building up with the war is now moot. It's
and then
now
you're told
over.
to go tell
Your
all
new
of
goal
them
is
to tell all of them to
peace.
stop fighting.
Yes, all these people that you've just got to join your fight, that we're not fighting anymore. It's peace, and I'm
Really?
a peaceful guy. I don't like war that much, but you don't build up to the war to end with peace. Like, I really thought, these peaceful negotiations are gonna break down, and we're gonna have to fight. But no, the peaceful negotiations go absolutely
Really,
splendid.
one thing is also, it wouldn't even be that bad if the end goal was peace, if there was at least, like, something interesting for the players to do involving that. Like, the players aren't negotiating the peace. You're just
Right.
told to stand there while all the
And-
other groups negotiate peace in front of you. Like,
And there's this thing called the Scourge, which are these enemies that are the sort of Lovecraftian enemy type, which you've seen throughout the game and you've heard about, but they were never really seemed like a main antagonist or anything. They seemed like a past problem.
yeah.
A problem that had been
Through the
dealt with.
environmental storytelling,
most
you could
part.
tell
There was
that
remnants.
they were definitely a problem at one point, but it doesn't really feel
At
like
some point,
they're
but
an
they didn't
urgent
seem
issue.
to be anymore. And then all of a sudden, in the final mission, after you build these negotiations, they become your main villain. They're attacking. They're all these things that
And
seemed to
only
be
for
fine
one
before are
mission,
failing.
too. It doesn't become
And-
this big chain of mission buildup, which would have been cool
Yeah,
if it was like an initial
absolutely.
attack, then you need to start building towards a counterattack or something. That would have been an amazing
Right.
setup to continue the game after having the most anticlimactic piece, like, just weird.
Yeah,
it was really weird decision.
And like I said, the overall mission design is uninspired, but because the locations you're going to are interesting, because the systems at their foundation are solid, because the gameplay is fun, the exploration is fun, these missions become fun and they're elevated, but the actual design of them is extremely bland and bare bones. It's just go to a place, talk to a guy,
that's the
kill some
majority of
things.
missions. And I mean,
to the
I kind of
ends.
get that when it comes to open world games, there is actually a certain limit on the different kinds of missions you can have without making huge, complicated mechanics to do just one kind of mission. Then, like, with this setup that you already have with the game being built to kill things and to explore and travel, it'd be hard to make missions that aren't about those. And I noticed that with a lot of games, where they kind of get into every mission's either a fetch quest or a kill something quest, or a talk to someone quest. That's how most of the open world games get into it.
It's better to make a quest that focuses on your main gameplay loop, though, I suppose, than a gimmick quest.
And also, them adding the consequences to certain quests, that does actually make those quests a little bit better, I think, when you know there's something on the line. But that's
that does
not
elevate them.
all quests. I won't even say it's half of the main story quests that have a you need to do this on time or something bad happens.
Yeah, I would agree. So overall, the story's
Oh,
not that
there-
great. We're hitting a pretty long length. I think that would. What were you gonna say? What
I
did you
was
want to
gonna
finish?
say
Let's finish
that
off with the
the
story.
final enemy they chose being just a large purple version of a relatively not
Just a reskin.
that difficult Scourge based enemy. Like the enemy they chose to reskin was not
Yeah.
necessarily that difficult to fight normally, but we killed the last boss
We killed
almost
the
instantly.
final boss
It wasn't that hard.
without even using much abilities, and then we go exploring, and the
Yeah.
first boss, like the place we decide to go, has a boss at the top of it that is 10 times harder and
Interesting.
more
It's like
grandiose.
the Lich seems like he
Yeah,
should be
and
the
it's
main
not-
bad guy.
We
Yeah.
could have went there beforehand too.
Like,
We could have
way
went there
more
before we beat
difficult.
the game.
Way more
but that-
build up just going through his tower that this guy is a problem. And then you get to the
Yeah.
top and he's just like, oh,
Um,
I'll let you guys go back down and leave and I won't kill you, but if you insult me, I'm going to destroy you. And that was leagues more interesting
and he did.
than a purple reskin of a not so great enemy.
Absolutely. But that's a good segue into, we'll talk about once you finish the game. This is something we actually didn't get into all that much. We just beat the game not very long ago. But something I want to talk about, something that really interesting the game does. And after you beat the game, throughout the world, 12 new end-game bosses are added to older locations. And for most of them, you need to gain a certain amount of rare materials. And the materials aren't like ridiculously rare. Me and Nate whipped up some of them together pretty quickly for a mid-tier boss. There's also things you might be able to go into one of these boss arenas if you have certain status effects, like you're poisoned or on fire, and luckily you only have to do this the first time you go in there, so if you die and you want to go back, you don't have to do this again. But it's a really, really good way to keep this game interesting.
Now
in the
that I
end game,
think
to give
about
this
it,
game an end game.
I don't think
And
that
I think
we touched up on dying at all.
No, we didn't. You know what? You're right. Alright, well, this is a good point because, like we talked about with the Lich, we get killed a lot by some of these bosses. The Lich actually isn't even an in-game boss, it's a base game boss. But yeah, we forgot to talk about dying. We'll put it right here at the end.
Fitting place for dying at the end.
So the death system... Right, exactly. The death system is really interesting. Actually, you know what, Nate, you take it.
If
Tell them about the death
in
system.
co-op, both people have to die for this to happen. You can just walk up and revive people in co-op, but in single player, if you die, it also happens the same way. The moment you die, you're gonna go through a loading screen, and it's gonna pop up with a little like paragraph that'll describe to you what you see around you, and a little kind of, it's usually a little blurry, so you don't know exactly what you're looking at, but yeah,
Sort of a painting,
and
almost, as a loading
it'll
screen.
usually describe like, oh, your body's racked with pain, and you, like, say dragged yourself out of the place that you just got killed, and you'll come back into the game
Right, and
waking
you wake
up
up,
in a random location with your bag nearby you most times. Actually, maybe all times, I'm not sure. But you'll just wake up in a random location,
Yeah, I think
usually within a certain distance of where you died, sometimes not, as long as it's in the same region. But one of the things that we had was we died and went into the cave with all the old man faces outside of it, and we were spawned in the bottom of the cave, surrounded by fire deer. And
And
yeah,
we had to escape this. And this was after we were already killed. I believe we were killed by
yeah,
a man who was on fire. It's sort of like a zombie that's constantly on fire, not just a man who
yeah.
happened
I
to be
think
on
that'd
fire.
be easy to kill a guy on
And I
fire.
believe being killed by this, I believe being killed by this specific enemy, is what spawned us here. He killed us, or I suppose you don't
Yeah.
actually die when you get killed. It explains how you survived, and so I suppose he dragged us into this area. And there's all kinds of different situations it can put you in. There's imprisonment in a bandit fortress if you get killed there. There's
Yeah,
a number of people who can save you or
Gap
take you
will
to a
give
city.
you his drink, and you'll just wake
Yeah.
up in a camp, and he'll give you a note.
Um, and it's just a very interesting system. It allows you to. It makes death feared but interesting at the same time, because when you die, you never know where you're going to end up. So there's always this gleeful randomness to it. This edge of your seat as
Yeah,
you're waiting
and
for that loading screen to
sometimes,
finish.
sometimes it can be a real inconvenience because it can take you pretty far away from where you died at. So if you want to go back and try to
But
fail that, then
right.
that's going to take some time occasionally.
But it can also, like, say you've just entered a region and you're trying to get to the city. Well, you die on your way, but then you wake up, somebody dragged you to the city, and so you got to skip half the journey. There's a positive. It's
Yeah.
a good amount of
Definitely
randomness,
more
and
interesting
it
than
allows
just
you
reload or reload a checkpoint
right.
the moment you die, things like that.
And it keeps you from save scumming and allows for death to be feared, and you feel like there is a consequence, a tangible consequence
For sure.
to dying.
Now, another thing, by the way, that I think we didn't touch on is legacy chests, which I think would be a good thing to talk about towards the end, since it's more of an end game thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it's a pretty basic thing overall. It is interesting though. You're right, especially I forgot. So in a couple different areas, there's these legacy chests, and what these do is at the beginning, when you're starting a new game, a second playthrough, you can pick the legacy of your previous character, and that then these chests will be filled with that item that you've put in them from your other character, and they will morph this item into a different, more improved version. And there are certain items you can only get through this legacy way, and so it can be really interesting seeing what items you can get and just giving your new characters items to help them with their playthrough. Although the morphing thing doesn't happen with this method, but using two people, there is a very simple method. You can just give basically everything you own to your new character, just by giving it to, joining a different player's game.
And make a new character.
Yeah, and then join in with a new character.
But
and
that
take all your
wouldn't
stuff
be
back.
nearly as fun.
That's what we're gonna be doing. That's what we're gonna be doing for our DLC reviews, though, and for playing through the DLCs.
Yeah,
Just
I might
FYI.
actually leave my halberd though in a legacy chest and see if it becomes something cooler.
Hey,
Especially
we'll
since
see.
it's a
That
unique
sounds
weapon.
interesting. Um, but yeah, and the only other thing is, so yeah, those 12 bosses after you beat the game, um, they're overall pretty interesting. Well, it's an interesting thing overall. We haven't fought those bosses, so we can't really speak on it. But I think it's a really interesting way of bringing back that exploratory spark that may have gone out as you've visited all these places
Yeah.
and explored everything. And it really offers a good end game, with each of them offering end game weapons as well that you can
I
create.
definitely feel like overall
So-
this game was really good, even with its lack of amazing story, because I feel like for a lot of the game we weren't really super focused on the main story, because there was so much
No, not at all.
cool and interesting things around us for us to focus on. Like, kind of gives me vibes of, say, like kind of like how No Man's Sky to me was really boring in its story, but getting there to the locations to do the story was way more interesting overall. And that's how this game feels. It's
Right,
like
it's
there's so much besides the main story that even though the main story is a little lackluster, this game, it's definitely still worth playing.
And I would absolutely agree. Although I would say this game's definitely not for everybody. You have to enjoy, especially in solo. I don't know if I would recommend this game in solo at all. I don't think I would. I don't think it would be nearly
Definitely
as fun solo.
enhances
I don't
the
think
time by having
I haven't played it much solo.
a friend to be there with you.
Yeah, I think it's a cheap game anyway, and the developer is a very small studio, needs support. So, I mean, if you can get it on the cheap, pick it up, try it solo. But if you have a friend, this is definitely something I would recommend. Something I would say you should buy and you should try. Again, if you are into the whole idea of traveling, of preparing for these journeys and these long-term consequences. I mean, we talk so much good about it, and it's a great game, but we are weird
That
people, Nate.
is
We are
true.
weird people that like weird things. And I don't know
I'd say if you
this
like the
is for
fantasy
everyone.
genre as a whole,
But I
though,
mean,
this game's definitely a good idea to check out, especially if you have a friend to play it with. I feel like it would be a slog,
true.
though, playing alone.
But I mean, hopefully, now, I mean, after listening to us talk about this for 2 hours, you have a bit more of an understanding of what this game is and whether you would be interested in it or not.
I don't know if we left this on a very good high note.
I think, I mean, it's like we said, it's a fantastic game for the people
Yeah,
that would be interested in it.
definitely.
Journey. It's a
like
journey. That's what it truly
Lord
is.
of the Rings, you're going to Mordor. That's how.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful explanation.
Like, you how many things we got wrapped up in?
and
Like, not side missions, by the way, just running into locations. How many things we got wrapped up in
right.
just by trying to get to the
Just
main locations?
Taking a walk.
Or
to get to
sometimes
the-
we're just like, hey,
Yeah,
you see
absolutely.
that giant cool thing in the distance? Let's go check it out.
But we're nearing about. We're getting pretty long of a video here, so I just wanted to wrap it up. Here in we're going to be looking at the Outward DLCs as well. They're full I mean, full expansions. First one's like 15 to 20 hours. Second one's like 20 to 25 hours. So it could be a month or a few weeks, a couple months before we get those videos out. But keep an eye out for our Outward Soroborians discussion and Outward Three Brothers discussion. If you enjoyed the video, of course, like it, subscribe it, comment with your thoughts on Outward and whether you might buy it if you haven't picked it up yet. And just thanks for listening. If you made it through the entire, 2 hours almost we've got here, we really appreciate it. And I was glad to introduce Nathaniel. I hope you enjoyed his insights, and
Right.
that'll
Bye.
wrap it up.